Hi there. This is a continuation of my prior video on how the Screen Actors Guild strike, joining in a sympathy strike with the Writers Guild of America, will affect or delay House of the Dragon Season 2. I already said, in short, they're on summer break anyway, and they have a different labor union, though some of the actors might break ranks, we don't really know, but we'll see what happens by August 10th, which is around the time they'll come back from that. I said I want to split off a longer video that I went through the history of the Screen Actors Guild strikes and Writers Guild strikes, and why the Writers Guild strikes have only ever really worked when they were joined by the Screen Actors Guild, which is a bigger and more powerful union. And that why is this strike happening now? That's a big thing. That the strike now, it isn't just, oh, more pay and stuff. It's rooted in issues from prior strikes. In many ways, they're still refighting the issues from the strike of 1988, which the writers actually lost, and kind of lost again in 2007. That if you're walking with no prior knowledge, saying, oh, it's about AI, chat, GPT stuff, it isn't about that. That is a symptom of cost-cutting attempts, but hardly the root cause. They're rehashing all these old issues. A lot of this is stuff George R.R. Martin talked about in his blog post when it began, which I made a separate video about, that they don't want to pay writers, they're just cutting different steps and saying, well, we don't have to pay for that. Really refighting the same issues. And fundamentally, every strike since the 50s ever came down to there was a format change, and the studios, the producers, would try to use it as a legal loophole to insist they didn't have to pay the writers or actors for work done in the new format. When you go through this, you see how ridiculous it is, by comparison, that, well, should we pay you that much for streaming content? In the 1950s, they were having literally the same argument over whether actors and writers should be paid when TV shows are rerun. Do reruns generate money for actors and writers? And you just draw a straight line from that to streaming residuals. Now, there have only been two major Screen Actors Guild strikes. One in 1960 and one in 1980. There's another shorter one in 1952 which led to the 1961. I'll explain that. The Writers Guild of America, in contrast, has had, prior to this, 4, maybe 5 major strikes, depending on how you count them. 1960, 1981, 1988, 2007. There was also a short one in 1973 that fizzled out, but then came back in the 81 strike. Now, if you've been watching the news, they've been saying a lot that this is the first time since 1960 that the Screen Actors Guild and Writers Guilds both went on strike at the same time. That the last time was 1960. That is technically true, but on closer inspection, I read up on this. The Screen Actors Guild strike of 1980 and the Writers' strike of 1981 were over the same issues, specifically the same issues, and should truly be seen as one really drawn-out restructuring of the entire system. I mean, it was within the same 12-month period that the Screen Actors Guild strike started July of 1980, and the writers' strike ended July of 1981. So they went on strike for like 3 months, and they went on strike for like 3 months over a related issue. So really those are one big thing. So there's these two big watershed moments in 1960 and 1980. But then other issues came up in 88 and 2007 following from that. Always over the specific issue of there's a new format. Other stuff gets tacked on, like pay increases and health insurance. That's not the core issue. It's not just some, oh, well, we felt like cutting costs this time. It's the studios latch on to a new format as an excuse. And the interesting thing I've noticed is these issues tended to spark a pair of strikes separated by about a decade. That first is when a new format is developed and it raises a controversy over theoretically how will the impact of this be. And then like 10 years later they have another strike refining that. So there was a theoretical issue strike in 52 that led to the practical issues strike of 1960. 1980 strike, which was huge, was really just the theory of what was how do videotapes affect things? 1988 was, okay, we've been living with this for 10 years, this is impractical, we need a better system. And you'll see it's paired like that, and even the 2007 strike and this current 2023 strike are that same pairing of 2007 was theoretically what happens if there's streaming television as the primary delivery system, and now it's true. So you see they're paired up like that. Well, the first pair of strikes, let's start with this. It's the ridiculousness of you've been trying to do this since reruns, saying you don't need to pay people. First Screen Actors Guild strike in 1952 only involved TV actors, not movie actors, so it wasn't an industry-wide strike. It didn't shut everything down. But both 52 and 1960 were over TV reruns. I actually think television was in its infancy in 1952. Movies were the overwhelmingly main concern. That the first Emmy Awards was in 1949. If you look at it, it's like variety shows and stuff. That I Love Lucy started in 1951. Gunsmoke wasn't even until 1955, Bonanza 1959. This was a strike in 1952, the year after I Love Lucy started. And up until that point, TV actors didn't get paid for TV reruns. You got a lump sum paycheck when you filmed the episode, and that was it, for its premiere. Then they said, oh, well, we'll run it more than once. We don't have to pay you. Why should I pay you for something you already did? It was a one-and-done type of thing. So they went on strike, and they determined that, okay, when we rerun TV episodes, you get another payment for that, and this pay for actors or writers when their show is rerun is called residuals. That's the major vocabulary term for this whole video. We're arguing over residuals. Payment for reruns or payment for second run, like if it's on video, cassette, if it's streaming, anything like that. The residuals that are beyond the pay you got for actually filming it. The 1952 strike, however, for the Screen Actors Guild only got rerun payments for TV shows. And just the cynicism of the studios that are willing to exploit loopholes. It didn't include residuals for movie actors when they rerun movies on television. Because that wasn't really a thing in 1952. I mean, it was a relatively new phenomenon. It's difficult for us to imagine just how much, like, event viewing there was before home media. I mean, like the early 50s to late 1970s, before there was home media, where if you wanted to watch something, you had to wait for it to air. And there were like 3 major channels. And that was it. So when they'd rebroadcast, like, Gone with the Wind or something, that was an event. Or the big one is Wizard of Oz. Have you ever seen A Christmas Story? With Ralphie? They rerun it every Christmas season in high rotation, A Christmas Story. It's set in the late 1950s. And when Ralphie goes... remember the scene where Ralphie goes to the Christmas parade and he goes to see the mall Santa? Do you remember that there's all these people in the Christmas parade and at the Santa's workshop dressed up in Wizard of Oz costumes? What does that have to do with Christmas? Well, starting in the mid to late 1950s, TV channels would start rerunning The Wizard of Oz. And it's not that different from what they do now, where, like, Thanksgiving weekend, they know America has a lot of family visiting, or over Christmas break, and the cable channels will heavily rerun, like, Star Wars and Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter, which have nothing to do with Thanksgiving, inherently. But it's a family thing that you can park the kids in front of when they're visiting. So back then, the Star Wars of its day was or the Marvel movie of its day was The Wizard of Oz. So they'd be rerunning this, and think there's 3 channels, you can't rent movies. Everyone would run home even the adults would watch The Wizard of Oz again on television, and it was amazing. And it became a cultural event. I mean, this was for a couple of decades. The annual Christmas season, everyone watches Wizard of Oz thing, to the point they associated it, and you'd have Christmas parades with Wizard of Oz in there. The thing was, up until 1960, they didn't have to pay a cent of residuals to the movie actors in things like Wizard of Oz because, well, residuals are for television reruns, not for movies that we put on TV. And everyone got really upset about this. So this led to the Screen Actors Guild strike of 1960 and also the Writers Guild strike of 1960, which was shorter and happened in the middle of it for the same reason. This is officially the last time they went on strike for the same time, but like I said, 1980 was really both of them, just separated by a few months. Now, during the 1952 and 1960 strikes, the president of the Screen Actors Guild, who led the negotiations, was a little-known cowboy actor by the name of Ronald Reagan. He was the head of the Screen Actors Guild, and he led them through this major crisis. That's how he got into politics. He was the head of a labor union. If you've ever seen, Back to the Future, when he goes to the 50s and he goes, oh yeah, Ronald Reagan is president in the 1980s, and he goes, Ronald Reagan, the cowboy actor, is president? Because he was this young, when he was younger, he was this actor, but he worked his way up to be through labor unions and stuff. So Ronald Reagan negotiated in 1952, look, you have to pay us when you rerun TV shows. And then as it got more advanced, they realized, oh, we can run movies on television. They said, we don't have to pay you. By all accounts, Ronald Reagan managed to secure some pretty good rights for the actors, given that the studios loudly and publicly disagreed that actors even had the right to unionize or to negotiate with them on any level. It's this infamous thing that Reagan bitterly joked that he had to spend months negotiating for his right to negotiate. They refused to even speak with him about it. How dare you ask us to pay for movies that we're rerunning? We already paid you once. And this is important. The studios wouldn't budge because they accurately judged that if they caved into the Actors Guild demands, they knew they'd have to make similar payments to the Writers Guild and the Directors Guild and musicians and everyone. So the Screen Actors Guild is the biggest and most powerful union out of all of them. There's all sorts of unions attached to this. The cinematographers, the lighters, the musicians, special effects, everything related to this. But the biggest one is the Screen Actors Guild. So after a lot of negotiations, the compromise they reached was that studios do have to pay residuals for movies made 1960 onward if they air them on television. But anything made before 1960, it's sort of like being public domain almost. They can run pre-1960 movies on TV without having to pay anyone anything. And the darndest thing is, I just saw this past 2 days. Have you noticed that if you flick on like a cable channel, I still have a cable connection, like TBS and like other major channels are like suddenly marathoning The Wizard of Oz the past 2 days? Because it's a pre-1960 movie, they don't have to pay anyone for it. It's this giant raised middle finger to, oh, you want residuals, do you? And this was the original thing that they went on strike for. We need residuals when you rerun our stuff on television, on the actual TV airwaves. Some people thought Reagan caved in for that, really yelled at him, but, you just, look, retroactive pay, okay, it already happened. But, it's weird looking back on it from, like, well over 60 years ago. Him saying, okay, we'll give you a pass for the stuff you ran in the 1950s on television. Which at the time was money to them. But think of how much TV has grown since then compared to how low the viewership for 1950s movies on TV must have been. Fair enough. So the stuff before 1960 is, you can run it without residuals. Ronald Reagan's 1960 SAG strike deal for the Actors Guild, and by extension the overlapping and then ripple effect, and the Writers Guild got a similar deal, is sort of the Magna Carta of contract deals for the movie and TV industry. Or in terms of Frank Herbert's Dune, this is the Great Convention, the Magna Carta, that the 1960 agreements with the Writers and Actors Guilds established the right of cast and crew for payment when you rerun something a second time. It's not a one and done, I already paid you once for this service. Well, you're reusing it. Yes, you should pay me again. And this extends to things like the music industry, and music residuals and everything. As I said, you see how the 1952 and 1960 strikes were paired, that the 52 strike was the theoretical, hey, There's this thing called reruns. 1960, reruns have been going on for a decade, and people realized we're not getting a lot of money, they're not even paying us for movies. And you see, what worked in this is because the Screen Actors Guild was the one that did the strike. They're more powerful than the Writers Guild, and it was an industry-wide strike. It was not just the TV people. 1952 was just the TV people. This was TV and movie actors. It shut everything down. That was the first big issue, reruns. Then we get to the second big issue. The 1980 and 1988 strikes were similarly paired. 1980 was theoretical, 88 was dealing with living with it for a decade. The 80 and 88 strikes were over the new phenomenon of home video cassette releases, as well as the new format of pay-per-view TV channels. Obviously streaming has surpassed this, but for the past couple of 20, 30 years, I grew up with, it's pay-per-view events and stuff. 1980, this was all theoretical. Home video had barely started. But even despite that, it caused a mass controversy. I don't know if there were really popular earlier formats. VHS only started in 1977, but by 1980 it got really contentious, even though it wasn't that big of an industry yet compared to what it later became, the home video industry. Negotiations broke down, and this led to the second of the two major Screen Actors Guild strikes they've ever had before this. No one, infamously, there's images of this, no one came to the Emmy Awards that year. They canceled it. Well, they had an empty ceremony, and only the actor Powers Booth showed up because he won. And in his acceptance speech, he said, "This is either the bravest or stupidest thing I've ever done, coming to this when no one else did." Just this empty stage. And like I said, the Writers Guild did go on strike over the same issue 6 months later. Same 12-month period. It's just, hey, the actors get that, we get that. And they succeeded because, look, the actors got it, you have to give it to us. Okay, we already established that principle. The entire justification for not paying the actors or writers was the studios, much like the rerun issue, cynically saying, technically this isn't the same thing. They said, this isn't technically a rerun, it's a VHS tape. Your contracts don't cover that. We're not rerunning it on television. And the strike wasn't even about the specific amount to pay them for VHS sales, but the basic concept in principle that you have to pay actors and writers residuals for home video cassettes. Just like the rerun thing in 52. But like I said, because the Screen Actors Guild went on strike, there's this juggernaut, they shut everything down, not just the Writers Guild, the studios pretty much caved into all of their demands and acknowledged that in general principle, yes, we have to pay you residuals for home video. There actually was another, I said before, minor Writers Guild strike in 1973 over the theory of home video. But it didn't really work, particularly because there weren't VHS tapes yet. It was just the theory of wow, it's a movie on a really big reel-to-reel tape you can technically buy and bring home. It was all theoretical, so they didn't work. By 1980, there was VHS tapes were technically available, and the Screen Actors Guild got involved and really got results. Not widespread yet, though, and that changed during the course of the 1980s. That VHS started in 1977, Betamax was 76, it actually came out first. Oh, by the way, not that I remember it, tangent here. The format war between VHS and Betamax in the 1980s, I barely remember this. I do not remember the 1980s. I start remember things like 1990. But I remember people talking about Betamax as a thing that had recently ended and missing that it stopped. Because Betamax was actually of a higher quality than VHS. But consider how much you could actually fit, even on Betamax, at relatively good quality. I'm thinking, I've seen stacks of old VHS tapes at anime clubs and stuff. You can only fit 2 episodes per tape at good quality. If you want a whole series, you have to buy a lot of tapes. So while VHS wasn't as good quality, it was cheaper. If you want to buy a whole series, it won out. The next format war didn't come until the early 2000s when we had Blu-ray versus, do you remember this? HD DVD? You might see old TV shows like Adult Swim make fun of HD DVD a lot of, oh, I'll get him a new HD DVD. It never really took off. and we had to wait for things to come out on Blu-ray until the format war ended, that they were waiting to see which one would win. Unlike the first round, where Betamax actually was better than VHS, Blu-ray is officially better than HD DVD. The whole point of HD DVD was that it was cheaper, but lower quality, but cheaper. Well, when you can fit like half a season on a single disc, or a whole movie really good quality on a Blu-ray, it was less important to have them cheap than it was to have it high quality. That it's not like, oh, I have to hoard over a dozen VHS tapes to get a whole season of a show. The Blu-ray alone could pretty much do that. So, whereas for a time Betamax was, oh, it's kind of a collector's thing, like HD DVD has no redeeming values. Use it as a doorstop. It's gone. It was crap compared to Blu-ray. That happened there. Tangent over. VHS turned into a giant industry unto itself over the course of the 1980s, going from a theoretical in 1980 to by 1988 it had mushroomed in size. They won the format war with Betamax, even despite both of them. I mean, it was a multi-million-dollar industry. And I looked up here, in 1980, maybe 2% of households had a VCR of any kind, a VHS or Betamax. Blockbuster, which older people here may remember as that big video rental chain that was really huge in the late 80s, 90s, Blockbuster Video for renting VHS tapes didn't get founded until 1985. So all this was theoretical in 1980. Blockbuster came out, mushroomed in size, suddenly everyone was getting VHS tapes. 1988, it was a serious problem that they weren't really paying them a lot of money for that, in terms of residuals. They had at least established in general principle that we do owe you some residuals for VHS sales. They were barely paying them anything, and this was huge now. It's a huge market share. We're getting ripped off. And again, this is paired with the 1980 strike. The 1988 strike was to refine, we need a better system. And this is the first strike I actually remember vaguely. I don't really remember the late 80s that well, but having grown up watching Star Trek, through late Next Gen, early Deep Space Nine, I do remember when you're rewatching stuff from Season 2 of Next Gen, that is the explanation of why is Next Generation Season 2 cut short. There was a writer's strike. That's how I vaguely remember that there was a writer's strike in 1988, how it affected Star Trek. But I didn't really understand it at the time. The 1988 strike was the longest and most contentious strike the WGA ever had. I said before the 2007 strike was 100 days long. This strike was 153 days long. So like I said, if the current 2023 strike ends, it'll surpass the previous 2007 strike on August 10th. That's 100 days into it after May 2nd. To surpass the 88 strike, this current strike will have to, 153 days, will be October 2nd. So August 10th, we surpass 2007. October 2nd, we surpass 1988. The 1980 Screen Actors Guild strike secured a 1/3 pay increase in general for actors. And during the negotiations in 1980, they wanted VHS residuals to be 12% of their gross revenue for home media. But they negotiated that down to, okay, actors get 4.5% of the gross profits for home media releases. Writers Guild didn't get nearly that good of a cut. They got them to acknowledge in their sympathy strike the next year that you owe us residuals. They got hardly any of that. Now, they used to use an entirely different system, too. And we're still feeling the repercussions of this today. Up until 1988, writers weren't paid a percentage of gross revenue, but a lump sum, up to $4,400 per rerun of an hour-long episode. In 1988 money, I used a converter. In modern money, that's like $12,000 in modern money for one rerun. And they said, you get paid residuals for the first 6 times we rerun it. 6 reruns, after that it's free, but okay, every time it reruns, a maximum of $4,400. $12,000 today's money. But that's the top. That you think about in today's money for 6 episodes, that's like $72,000 just for the reruns for a single episode. That's pretty good. And keep in mind also that TV seasons were longer then. You would write more than one. A writer would tend to do more than one episode on an hour-long show. But that's the top of the thing. I read an article here. It says like a more typical pay for a show, like the typical pay level was like Murder, She Wrote or something. That was the average pay. All 6 reruns of a single episode would get you nearly $17,000 in 1988 money, or $45,000 today's money. So for writing one episode, just on the reruns, not even the pay you got for writing it, but from all the reruns, you get in 2023 money about $45,000. That's pretty decent, and you're probably going to write more than one episode. But it was a lump sum payment. They didn't have the percentages like how the actors secured a flat 4.5% for everything. Come 1988, after dealing with reruns and stuff and home video releases for years, the producers wanted to revamp the whole system altogether, pointing out accurately that as time passed, as they measured reruns and stuff, like, not all reruns do very well. Like, a couple of hit shows have good rerun figures or good home media. 90% of everything is crap. Most things don't get home video sales or reruns that are doing that great. So, the producers in 1988 wanted to switch to a sliding scale format. Not just a percentage, but relative to how successful that show is, we'll give you a percentage of the revenues. And in principle, that isn't, on paper I can see that as a reasonable request. That, look, these reruns aren't doing anything, I'm not going to pay a lump sum if I don't know it's a hit, I'll give you a percentage of the profits from it. Fair enough. Though imagine if, at your job like today, if you're like a Starbucks worker or a factory worker, if they said, we're going to pay you a percentage of the profits rather than a flat wage. Then what if the company is doing badly? You won't pay us anything? Exactly. But on paper, okay, like, not all reruns do well. Not everything sells VHS tapes well. They wanted to make a percentage system. And on top of this were the other things that George R. Martin talked about in his blog post, that the writers wanted more creative control to choose directors and actors. Up until then, showrunners didn't choose their own directors and actors. They were assigned to them through the studio system. Writers Guild didn't do well in the 1988 strike. The producers got what they wanted to switch to a percentage-based residual system. Though the writers did get some concessions. They got better pay system for foreign residuals, not domestic ones. This is stupid. That they acknowledged it's important. They said if it does really well internationally, you get a better cut of the international sales. You could either choose between the old max for foreign sales, the old maximum of lump sum of $4,400, or up to 1.2% of the gross revenue. 1.2% for foreign stuff when actors were getting 4.5%. And it was drastically less when it came to domestic stuff. For VHS tapes specifically, they set residuals for domestic VHS tapes for writers at 0.3% of the gross profits. They're getting 0.3% in America, up to a mere 1.2% if it's doing well internationally. And meanwhile, the actors over there are getting 4.5%. Like, it's 15 times as much. And they asked for 12 and got 4.5, the actors. And on top of this, they did allegedly get some more creative choices. I think some of this, at least, is true. The showrunners pick their own directors now, pick their own cast, but this touches on things Martin talked about in his blog post that I don't know a lot about. That today it doesn't seem like they have a lot of creative control, that studios assign showrunners to things. They don't want to train them, the things Martin talked about, they don't want to train them how casting works. A lot of this is power of the purse stuff, that they said, well, you have creative control over casting, but we're not going to pay you to do the casting process. You have to do it yourself. We're not going to give you pay, the time is money, we're not going to give you pay for the day that you spent doing casting stuff, or learning how casting works, or production-related things like Martin said in his blog post, I went around the set, they showed me how to build, how the building stuff takes. This is why on Game of Thrones there was all this disconnect of they really didn't understand the logistics of how long it takes to film. I think they admitted as much. We don't know anything about the filming process. And Martin said this in his blog, that how the hell are new experienced writers new showrunners going to come around if you don't want to pay to train them? And that gradually, I guess it's just over 30 years, they chipped away at all of this using power of the purse, of creative control. Complex question I don't have a direct answer for, but they got some creative concessions, they got better international stuff, but 0.3% domestic VHS profits compared to actors getting 4.5%. That's crazy. So, all the stuff going on with the mini rooms is the phrase Martin talked about in his thing of, they don't want to hire a full writer's room. We'll just hire a mini room of the top 2 or 3 golden boy showrunners. And they keep trying to, I think they actually convince themselves of their own propaganda. We don't need a full writer's staff. We need this really cool showrunner who is this wonderkind Superman who knows how to do all of these tasks. And they started to believe it. That I don't need to pay to train someone how casting works or how physical set construction works. It comes down like that thing from that Chernobyl miniseries, that why is all this happening? It's cheaper. Sorry I'm rambling. Just in short, the studios have been nickel and diming them, and they slashed all of the quality control measures since 1988, the quality control measures from the writing process, and just assumed nothing would go wrong. Why should we pay you for doing rewrites? You already wrote it. Because it's a big continuous process. Writing only ends when it airs. You think when it's done filming, you're constantly rewriting and refining things. That just as, oh, reruns don't count, VHS tapes don't count, oh, we don't have to pay you for rewrites. The cynicism of that, and it's not that it's immoral, it's impractical. You really think a good show is going to come from cutting that many corners? It's like that whole thing of, why should we pay for fire extinguishers? Why should we pay to why should we have fire drills during which the staff are the employees are technically paid for a day where they just learned where the stairwell is they need to go out during fire? Well, what if there's a fire? You don't have fire extinguishers and no one knows where to go because you never hold fire drills. Why worry about something that isn't going to happen? Like the Chernobyl thing, it's basically the mentality they had. So they were cutting, we don't need to pay you for rewrites, we need to pay to train you how filming logistics work, and it just spiraled from there, even as they were posting record profits. So the Writers Guild really lost the 1988 strike. But on the creative stuff, the most obvious was 0.3%. And then we come to the 2007 strike, was a continuation of that, and many, even though it was 20 years later, people at the time were, in the articles I read, very specifically were still feeling bitter about losing the 1988 strike because none of the issues were resolved from it. And really the reason I think these later strikes failed, the 1988 and 2007 strikes largely failed, is because there was no corresponding Screen Actors Guild strike. You saw them get results when there was a Screen Actors Guild sympathy strike in 1960, when there was a Screen Actors Guild sympathy strike in 1980. 1988 didn't have that. Neither did 2007. 2007 strike, which we all do remember, was over new media on the internet. Remember, this was like the end of the mid-90s. I remember it was this whole slate of shows like Lost, then Battlestar Galactica, then Heroes, which were trying to do this mystery element thing. And then after that, well, Breaking Bad started right before the strike, but after that, coming out of that strike was what you call a sea change, a chapter break. Or after the 2007 strike, which extended into early 2008, it was really the Breaking Bad Mad Men era. And before that, of course, was the golden age of HBO from like 1997 to 2007, but that was a chapter break, the 2007 strike. just as the other strikes were about reruns or about should we pay residuals for VHS tapes, this was about new media on the internet streaming TV. They pretty much completely jumped over DVD, even though that was a huge market by that point. DVD wasn't a thing in 1988. It came out in 1996. Really started getting widespread 2001. That's when I really remember people getting DVDs. It was like The Matrix and Lord of the Rings in 2001. By 2003, DVD profits had outpaced VHS profits. It's happened really fast. And more importantly, by 2007, the year of the strike, DVD sales profits had outpaced movie theater box office profits. Home media was bigger than the actual movie theaters now. This number we have here, 2004, from January to March, the box office took in almost $2 billion, while at the same time DVD took in $5 billion in profit. It's doing over twice as much, and it's increasing every time. The DVD market was exponentially increasing in size. But because the studios wouldn't budge without a strike, they were still operating under 1988 rules, which said that home media, be it VHS or this new DVD thing, they were charging the same formula they did for VHS tapes in 1988. 0.3% of the profits for the DVD market, which by 2004 was bigger than movie theaters in terms of profit. Even then, though, here's the thing. The Writers Guild chose to ignore the DVD issue and didn't even put up a fight over it. They secured no new concessions to residual formulas for DVDs because by 2007, they accurately saw the writing on the wall. Even not just that Blu-ray was coming out, but they saw physical home media won't be the future in 5 to 10 years. It's going to be internet and streaming TV. I mean, even what you're watching me on right now, YouTube started in 2005. And it was mind-blowing. I remember when it came out, we just watched all the cartoons that were loaded up onto it and other TV show clips and the community that started forming and the review community. That was in its infancy then, but they saw that it was there, it was the future. And most importantly, by no accident, Netflix and Hulu launched earlier in 2007. The first big thing. Now, Netflix didn't start making its own content until 2013, but they were rerunning content libraries, and again, the residuals are for reruns. Netflix launched January of 2007. Hulu launched October 29th. The strike started November 2nd. But of course, they knew months in advance that Hulu was coming and Netflix was coming, so the rise of Netflix and Hulu, and to an extent YouTube and others, they saw that the future was streaming. Digital stuff with that. So they didn't even put up a fight over home media anymore in terms of physical home media. They said it's about the streaming content. We can see that this will be the primary delivery system. Just as DVD has outpaced actual movie theaters, this will outpace DVD and movie theaters as well. Openly bitter about the open wounds that they still had from the 88 strike, that you're giving us 0.3% and the actors 4.5%. They were really annoyed that we got screwed with the VHS tapes, we got screwed with the DVDs, we're getting screwed over about the residuals for streaming again. Went on strike. The 2007 strike didn't really work because the Screen Actors Guild didn't join them. They managed to secure the general principle, at least, that writers should be paid residuals for online and streaming content. Again, before that, they were going... I remember, like, when they had... It was so mind-blowing when they had, like, webisodes on what YouTube wasn't a thing, but was on their website, for Lost, for Battlestar Galactica, and for Heroes. Like, a tie-in webisode series was mind-blowing in 2006, 2007. It wasn't a thing before that. And the actors for those, I remember them specifically complaining from those shows, we aren't getting paid to do this because our contracts don't cover web content. It's just like, you can draw a straight line to 1952, the studio's saying, why should I pay you for reruns? I already paid you. It's not the same thing. 1980, why should I pay you for home video release? It's not a rerun. It's a distinction without a difference. They even had rules in place after the 1980 strike for pay-per-view, What is streaming content but pay-per-view? In some cases, well, there's two kinds of streaming content. There is download to own. I never really use it, but it is a thing. Or when you have to do an app purchase, a one-time purchase for a movie rental through a streaming app. Download to own and stuff, that's one kind. And then there's a different kind for streaming with ads, or streaming and the cost is considered part of the subscription numbers. They didn't really get good profit margins, though. That they managed to secure in 2007 that, yes, conceptually you're supposed to be paid residuals for this, but they paid them chump change. That download to own, WGA got them 1.2% residuals. But as for actual streaming, the rule is, since 2007, for streaming content, writers get 2% of profits beyond the first 17 days. And this is all if it's ad-supported, however they calculate the profits based on the viewership relative to the subscriber cost of Netflix as a whole, or whatever they consider the profit margin that this episode's viewership was responsible. And they can measure viewership. That's the beauty of streaming. You can see the numbers very clearly and do algorithm research on which shows are doing best. You only get paid 2% after like the first 3 weeks, which is one of the reasons that they start cycling shows off of streaming services after like a month or so. They don't want to pay writers residuals, or the actors. And of course this hurts the smaller shows most of all, and it's the Actors Guild gets 4.5%. You had to argue them tooth and nail to 2%, which still isn't enough. Like on the smaller shows, this is a big thing the past few days when the Screen Actors Guild went on strike. Videos of major actors saying, I'm doing well because I'm like Sean Astin or Leslie Jones or something. For regular, just background actors and stuff, they don't make enough to qualify for health insurance off of this from their residuals. This isn't a living wage for them. They can't survive on this. And the studio executives are giving themselves multi-million-dollar bonuses. The money is there. This, when they're going, oh, well, we invested too much in the streaming boom and peak TV. Give your executives a goddamn pay cut. I don't even know what they do all day in terms of their physical activity. What is it that you do all day in terms of work? Well, I manage the mergers, and you consider this to be worth $100 million. Relative to that, and again, it's not the morality of it, it's the actors can't keep working if they can't pay for health insurance and food, or their houses. It is destroying their ability to work for you, or to make good quality work. And just, why are you cutting corners on your own machine? That they're the grass on which you feed. It doesn't work that way. That it's impractical. So, the last two strikes in 1988 and 2007 really didn't work. They at best got them to acknowledge, yes, you technically have the right to streaming stuff. They didn't work as the Actors Guild wasn't involved. Now, in the current strike, for the first time in over 40 years, the Screen Actors Guild has joined the Writers Guild in a strike. I can't guarantee if this will get results, but it has hope. More than they've had in decades, because the 1960 and 1980 strikes, when the actors joined them, they got results.